In just 47 seconds, what started as promotional banter turned into an explosive character assassination that left Mark Wahlberg's reputation hanging by a thread. Those crucial seconds witnessed Jimmy Kimmel unleash a calculated attack that systematically dismantled the actor's carefully crafted public image, triggering a meltdown of epic proportions that would see Wahlberg abandon his chair and storm off the stage in front of millions of viewers. The tension was palpable from the moment Wahlberg stepped onto the Jimmy Kimmel live stage. What should have been standard promotional fodder for his latest action thriller quickly devolved into something far more sinister. Kimmel, known for his sharp wit and occasional controversial takes, seemed unusually aggressive from the opening handshake, his smile not quite reaching his eyes as he gestured for the Boston native to take his seat. "Mark Wahlberg, everybody," Kimmel announced to the studio audience, his voice carrying an undertone that seasoned viewers would recognize as trouble brewing. The applause felt forced, almost mechanical, as if the audience sensed something was off about their host's demeanor tonight. Wahlberg, dressed in his typical understated style dark jeans and a fitted black t-shirt, settled into the guest chair with the confidence of someone who'd done this dance hundreds of times before. But Kimmel wasn't interested in playing the usual game tonight. Instead of the customary warm-up questions about family or upcoming projects, he dove straight into murky waters. "So Mark, I've got to ask you something that's been bothering me," Kimmel began, leaning forward with an intensity that immediately shifted the energy in the room. "You've built this whole image as this reformed bad boy from Dorchester, right? The guy who turned his life around, found God, became a family man. But I'm curious, when exactly did you decide to start rewriting history?" The question hit like a sledgehammer. Wahlberg's expression froze, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. The studio audience fell silent, sensing they were witnessing something far removed from typical late-night television banter. "I'm sorry, what are you getting at, Jimmy?" Wahlberg's voice was controlled, but there was steel beneath the surface. His hands, which had been casually draped over the armrests, now gripped them with white-knuckle intensity. Kimmel's smile widened, but it was the kind of smile that preceded a knife thrust. "Oh, come on, Mark. You know exactly what I'm talking about. This whole 'I was just a troubled kid who made mistakes' narrative, that's some pretty creative storytelling for someone who committed actual hate crimes as a teenager." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Wahlberg's face flushed red, his Boston accent becoming more pronounced as his composure began to crack. "You want to go there tonight, Jimmy? Really? You want to dredge up shit from when I was 16 years old? I think it's relevant when you're constantly positioning yourself as some kind of moral authority," Kimmel shot back, his voice rising slightly. "You've made millions selling this redemption story, but let's be honest about what you were actually redeemed from. We're not talking about shoplifting candy bars here." The studio audience was dead silent now, the usual scattered laughter and supportive cheers completely absent. This wasn't entertainment anymore, it was a public execution disguised as an interview. Camera operators instinctively tightened their shots, sensing they were capturing something that would be dissected and analyzed for years to come. Wahlberg leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more weight than shouting would have. "You know what, Jimmy? I've spent the last 30 years of my life trying to make amends for the stupid shit I did as a kid. I've worked with communities. I've donated millions to charities. I've tried to be a better person every single day. But assholes like you can't let it go, can you?" "Maybe because you never really owned it," Kimmel replied, his tone becoming increasingly confrontational. "You've done plenty of interviews where you dance around the details, where you minimize what actually happened. You assault innocent people because of their race, and then 40 years later you want a pat on the head for becoming a movie star." The accusation hit Wahlberg like a physical blow. His entire body language shifted, shoulders squaring as if preparing for a fight. "You think this is easy for me? You think I don't think about that shit every single day? I was a messed up kid from a broken home who made terrible choices, but I've spent my entire adult life trying to make up for it." "Have you, though?" Kimmel pressed, sensing blood in the water. "Or have you just gotten really good at public relations? Because, from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've built a career on playing tough guys, while conveniently glossing over the fact that you actually were one, and not the good kind." The insult landed with devastating precision. Wahlberg's face contorted with rage, his voice rising to match his host's aggression. "You want to talk about being authentic, Jimmy? Let's talk about how you built your career on making fun of people, on cheap shots and gotcha moments. At least I own my mistakes. You just hide behind your desk and tear people down for entertainment." But Kimmel wasn't backing down. If anything, Wahlberg's counterattack seemed to energize him, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. That's rich coming from someone who's made a fortune playing the working-class hero while living in Beverly Hills mansions. You think slapping your name on a burger joint makes you connected to your roots? The mention of his restaurant chain hit a nerve that even Wahlberg hadn't realized was exposed. His voice became dangerously quiet again, each word dripping with barely controlled fury. "You know what your problem is, Jimmy? You've been sitting behind this desk so long, making jokes about other people's lives, that you've forgotten what it's like to actually struggle for something, to actually work for redemption instead of just talking about it." The confrontation was reaching a boiling point, with both men now fully committed to destroying each other in front of a live audience. What had started as an ambush was rapidly evolving into mutual assured destruction, and neither man seemed willing to be the first to blink. The studio lights felt hotter, the silence between their exchanges more loaded with potential violence, as if the very air itself was holding its breath for what would come next. The moment of silence stretched on, thick with unspoken threats and wounded pride. Then Kimmel made his fatal mistake. He smiled. Not the practiced television smile he'd perfected over 2 decades of hosting, but something cruel and predatory that transformed his face into something almost unrecognizable. "You know what, Mark? I think we should talk about your pardon request," Kimmel said, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Remember that? In 2014, when you petitioned the state of Massachusetts for a pardon for your assault convictions? That's interesting timing, don't you think? Right around when you were trying to get that liquor license for Wahlburgers?" The blood drained from Wahlberg's face. This wasn't public knowledge that Kimmel was casually throwing around. This was research, preparation, a calculated assassination attempt that had been planned well in advance of tonight's show. The realization hit him like a freight train, and with it came a rage unlike anything he'd felt since his youth. "Are you fucking kidding me right now?" Wahlberg's voice cracked like a whip across the silent studio. Several audience members visibly flinched at the raw fury in his tone. "You brought me here under false pretenses to ambush me with this shit? What kind of sick game are you playing?" But Kimmel was just getting started. He leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man holding all the cards, clearly relishing the moment he'd been building toward all night. "I'm not playing any games, Mark. I'm just curious why you needed that pardon so badly. Was it really about putting the past behind you? Or was it about protecting your business interests?" "You son of a bitch," Wahlberg snarled, his entire body trembling with barely contained violence. "You think you know me? You think you know what I've been through, what I've had to live with? You sit here in your little bubble, making jokes about people's real lives, real pain, real consequences." The studio audience was completely silent now, trapped between fascination and horror at what they were witnessing. This wasn't entertainment anymore, it was a public flaying, a character assassination broadcast live to millions of homes across America. Camera operators continued filming, but their hands shook slightly as they captured every brutal exchange. Kimmel's attack continued relentlessly, each word designed to inflict maximum damage. "But here's what really gets me, Mark. You've never actually apologized to your victims, have you? Not really. You talk about redemption and second chances, but you've never actually faced the people whose lives you damaged." "That's not true," Wahlberg shot back, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. The accusation had hit home, and Kimmel sensed the weakness immediately. "Isn't it though? Because I did some research and trust me, I do my homework, and I couldn't find a single interview where you actually named your victims or acknowledged the specific harm you caused them. It's always been about you, hasn't it? Your redemption, your growth, your success story. What about Johnny Trin? What about the other people you terrorized?" The mention of specific names sent Wahlberg over the edge. He shot up from his chair so violently that it rolled backward several feet, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a terrifying moment, it looked like he might actually launch himself across the desk at his tormentor. "Don't you dare!" he roared, his voice echoing through the studio with raw, primal fury. "Don't you fucking dare use their names as weapons against me! You don't know what conversations I've had, what attempts I've made, What doors have been slammed in my face? You think redemption is supposed to be public? You think healing is supposed to be performed for your entertainment? But Kimmel wasn't intimidated by the physical display. If anything, he seemed energized by Wahlberg's loss of control, sensing that he was moments away from achieving whatever twisted goal he'd set for tonight's interview. I think accountability is supposed to be public when you've built a career on selling a redemption narrative. You can't have it both ways, Mark. You can't profit from your story of transformation while keeping the ugly details private. The accusation of profiting from his past trauma was the final straw. Wahlberg's face contorted with enrage so pure and overwhelming that several audience members actually stood up, as if preparing to flee. His voice, when it came, was barely human, more of a growl than speech. You want ugly details, Jimmy? You want the real story? You want to know what it's like to wake up every single day knowing that you hurt innocent people? To carry that weight, that guilt, that shame for 30 fucking years? To have every achievement, every success, every moment of happiness tainted by the knowledge of what you were capable of as a scared, angry kid? The raw emotion in Wahlberg's voice was so intense that it seemed to physically push against the studio audience. Several people were crying, not from sympathy, but from the sheer overwhelming nature of witnessing someone's soul being torn apart on live television. Kimmel, however, remained unmoved by the display of genuine anguish. That's very moving, Mark, but it still doesn't answer my question about the pardon. It still doesn't address the pattern of behavior where you only address your past when it's convenient for your career. That was it. That was the moment when whatever restraint Wahlberg had left completely shattered. You know what, Jimmy? Wahlberg's voice had dropped to a deadly whisper that somehow carried more menace than all his previous shouting. You want to know about patterns of behavior? Let's talk about your pattern. You've made a career out of humiliating people. You've built your entire brand on cheap shots and gotcha moments. And now you're sitting here attacking me for crimes I committed when I was 16 years old, while you're doing something just as fucking ugly right here, right now. The comparison hit Kimmel like a physical blow. His practiced composure flickered for the first time all night, a crack appearing in the armor of righteous indignation he'd wrapped himself in. But Wahlberg wasn't finished, not by a long shot. You want to talk about accountability, Jimmy? Where's your accountability for the people you've destroyed on this show? The careers you've ended with your little comedy bits? The lives you've made miserable for a laugh? At least I was a stupid kid. You're a grown man who hurts people for money and calls it entertainment. The studio fell into an even deeper silence, if such a thing was possible. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and for the first time since the interview began, Kimmel looked genuinely rattled. His usual quick wit seemed to have abandoned him, leaving him scrambling for a response that wouldn't come. Wahlberg seized on the moment of weakness, pressing his advantage with the ruthless efficiency of a man who'd learned to fight on the streets of Dorchester. You're a bully, Jimmy. You've always been a bully. The only difference between you and me is that I grew out of it. You just found a way to get paid for it. That's not, Kimmel started, but Wahlberg cut him off with a savage laugh that contained no humor whatsoever. That's not what? That's not true? Look around, Jimmy. Look at what you've done here tonight. You ambushed me with personal information, dragged my victims' names through the mud for your little gotcha moment, and humiliated me in front of millions of people. And for what? Ratings? Your own twisted sense of moral superiority? The host was visibly struggling now, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been shame. I was holding you accountable. Bullshit! Wahlberg exploded, his voice echoing through the studio with devastating force. You were putting on a show. You were using my pain, my victim's pain, my family's pain, all for your fucking television show. You're no better than I was at 16, Jimmy. You're worse. Because you should know better. The comparison to his teenage self clearly stung Kimmel deeply. His face contorted with rage as he abandoned any pretense of journalistic integrity. Don't you dare compare what I do to what you did. I've never committed a hate crime. I've never assaulted innocent people because of their race. No, Wahlberg shot back, his voice dripping with contempt. You just assault people psychologically for entertainment. You destroy people's reputations and dignity and call it comedy. At least, when I hurt people, I didn't pretend it was for the greater good." The brutal honesty of the statement left Kimmel speechless. For a moment, the practiced television host disappeared entirely, replaced by a man who'd been stripped bare of all his defenses and found wanting. The studio audience watched in fascination as their usually unflappable host struggled to regain his composure. But Wahlberg wasn't done. 30 years of carrying the weight of his past, 30 years of being judged and attacked and reminded of his worst moments, had finally found their outlet. "You want to know the real difference between us, Jimmy? I've spent every day since I was 18 trying to be better. I've worked with kids from rough backgrounds. I've put my money where my mouth is. I've tried to use whatever platform I have to help people avoid the mistakes I made. But you just tear people down and pat yourself on the back for it." The accusation landed with devastating accuracy. Kimmel's face went through a series of emotions: rage, denial, and finally something that looked suspiciously like recognition. He'd spent so many years attacking others that he'd never stopped to examine his own behavior, his own capacity for cruelty. "And you know what the really sick part is?" Wahlberg continued, his voice building toward a crescendo of fury. "You probably think you're the hero in this story. You probably think you're some kind of truth-telling journalist, holding me accountable for my past. But all you've done is prove that you're exactly the kind of person who creates the environment where kids like I was think that violence and hatred are acceptable." The final accusation hit Kimmel like a sledgehammer. The suggestion that his behavior contributed to the very problem he claimed to be addressing left him reeling, unable to formulate any kind of coherent response. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the cameras was audible. Wahlberg looked around the studio, taking in the stunned faces of the audience, the uncomfortable crew members, and finally, settling his gaze back on his tormentor. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, controlled, but filled with absolute finality. "You know what, Jimmy? I came here tonight to promote a movie, to talk about my work, my family, maybe share a few laughs. Instead, I got ambushed by someone who's apparently never learned the difference between holding people accountable and publicly humiliating them for sport. I've made my mistakes, and I've spent my entire adult life trying to atone for them. But I don't have to sit here and take this shit from someone who's made a career out of being cruel and calling it comedy." With that, Wahlberg straightened his shirt and looked directly into the main camera, addressing the audience at home rather than the man who'd spent the last 20 minutes trying to destroy him. "To anyone watching this who's made mistakes in their past, real mistakes that hurt people, let me tell you something. Redemption is possible, but it's not a performance. It's not something you do for applause or forgiveness. It's something you do because it's right, because it's necessary, because the people you hurt deserved better from you." He turned back to Kimmel one last time, his expression a mixture of disgust and pity. "As for you, Jimmy, maybe it's time you looked in the mirror and asked yourself what kind of person you've become. Because from where I'm standing, you're not much different from the angry kid I used to be, you're just better dressed." Without another word, Wahlberg turned and walked off the stage, leaving behind a stunned studio audience and a host who looked like he'd been hit by a truck. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the silent studio until he disappeared behind the stage curtain, leaving Kimmel alone with the wreckage of what had been intended as his moment of triumph. The camera stayed focused on Kimmel's face for several long seconds, capturing every nuance of his shock and discomfort as he struggled to process what had just happened. Finally, he managed to croak out a weak, "We'll be right back," but the damage was done. Mark Wahlberg had walked off the show, but he'd also walked away with his dignity intact, leaving his attacker to face the consequences of his own cruelty.